You love her voice, you love her looks, but Melissa loves our comic books. Hi everyone, welcome back. You're getting a different view of the living room today because I have a guest sitting over here who doesn't want to be seen on camera. So, let's get started. The countdown to Superman continues, and I have so many comic books from February 1938 to talk about that it's taking 2 episodes. This is the second one. Number 46. Star Ranger number 10. This is a tough one to start on because it is no secret to my viewers that I am not a fan of the Chesler Studio, and this was another Chesler Studio title. Even tougher because Star Ranger number 10 is not one of that is available online. Scans of only the first 7 issues are out there on the internet. Someone must have access to it though somewhere because the Grand Comic Book Database website lists the contents of this issue. So I know there is some overlap between the contents of issue 7 and issue 10. And so my random feature I'm going to talk about from this issue, limited to ones I've been exposed to from the first 7 issues, is Lyin Lou. Lyin Lou is a 2-page joke feature in which Lou tells a big fib that may or may not be funny. This page is from the Lyin Lou feature in issue 7. Eagle-eyed viewers might recognize the artist as Fred Gardenier. I last talked about Gardenier way back in episode 28, and we'll talk about him a lot more in the future once he jumps ship and moves over to Detective Comics. Other than liking Fred's art, I've got nothing to say about Lyin Lou or Star Ranger. Number 45. Funny Picture Stories Volume 2, Number 6. For this one, I'm going to talk about Jack Strand, and we may spend a good amount of time on Jack Strand for a character you probably never heard of. Jack Strand debuted just 5 issues earlier in Funny Picture Stories Volume 2, Number 1. That was the beginning of a serialized adventure wherein Jack learned that there was a realm of the subconscious ruled by a villain named Psyche, the first costume supervillain in comic books, even if both the name and the costume were pretty laughable. Jack was given a magic item that protected him from Psyche's powers, effectively making Jack Strand a superhero, minus just a few conventions of the genre. He never adopted a secret identity, never wore a costume, never had a character-defining origin story, and his magic item was only good for that first adventure. But as I read Jack bearding Psyche in his lair and the battle between good and evil being reduced to and resolved by a fistfight, I saw this as an important bridging character between the adventure and superhero genres, like Dr. Occult before him. The stories are even resolved in 3 7-page installments, about the same total length as a modern-day superhero comic book. I was impressed enough that, when I revived Funny Picture Stories as my own reprint anthology series, I included the entire Psych storyline. Subtle plug there. Jack Strand was the creation of Frank Frollo. Frollo, who sounds like he's a Tolkien character, was actually a 23-year-old New York artist who had been doing editorial cartoons for the New York Mirror before he was hired by the Chesler Studio. Frank wasn't very good. His anatomy was often off. He also had a habit of not even finishing the art in the panels. For the Psych storyline, this actually worked to his advantage, giving the whole story the feeling like it was happening in a dream. The rest of the time, it just looked awfully unprofessional. The second adventure of Jack Strand ends in this issue, and if you think the Psych story was weird, this time Jack and his girlfriend Diana go underground to find out who is causing a local drought, and it's happening because of this war between giants and pygmies living underground. Except calling them giants is a little disingenuous since they are at best maybe 6 inches taller than Jack. Jack tries to trick the two sides into wiping each other out, and when that doesn't work, both sides realize Jack is this really awful guy and go after him. They follow Jack back to the surface, where they learn that in surface gravity, every time they take a big lungful of air, they just float around in the sky. The locals think this is hilarious, but Jack knows that if they figure out how to control their floating into flight, they are going to start killing people for what Jack tried to do to them. So instead of apologizing to the giants and the pygmies and trying to make amends for what he's done, Jack doubles down as soon as the windstorm approaches, starts a wildfire in the path of the windstorm, and watches as the giants and pygmies go sailing into the fire and burn. As much as I like to think Jack Strand was an early prototype for the superhero genre, maybe he's a villain in the horror genre, at least in this storyline. Number 44, Ace Comics number 12. This time we're going to talk about Blondie. Blondie was one of the comic strips that I grew up with in the Chicago Tribune, so it's fun to go back now and see how it all started. Murat Bernard Young, who went by Chick Young because his high school nickname was Chicken. Just from this introduction alone, you'd think that this isn't the guy who would go on to create one of the most successful comic strips of all time, but he did. His older brother, Lyman, was the artist of a comic strip, Tim Tyler's Luck, and Lyman encouraged his younger brother to enter the field. He was taking art classes at the Art Institute of Chicago when he heard there was a cartoonist job opening in Cleveland, so he packed up and moved there. That strip that he created when he got there was, no, not Blondie, it was The Affairs of Jane. But after that strip failed, he created a new strip, and that was, no, not Blondie, this time it was Beautiful Bab. But when that strip failed, he created a new strip, and no, still not Blondie. This one was Dumb Dora. This one actually was moderately successful, so much so that Chick and his wife were able to move to Long Island, New York, and start a family. Chick demanded at this point to be released from Dumb Dora and given a new strip so that he could own it. And then he created Blondie. But he was a one-trick pony. Every strip was about a pretty blonde flapper who's an airhead. This was a whole genre of comic strips in the late 1920s and 1930s, and in 1930 when Blondie came out, this genre was starting to wear a little thin, and Blondie wasn't any more popular than Dumb Dora had been. The one thing Blondie had no other strip had was Dagwood Bumstead. Readers liked this suitor for Blondie, a rich playboy so smitten with poor Blondie that he was willing to upset his wealthy parents by seeing her. In 1932, Young was going to write Dagwood out of the strip, but readers complained so vehemently that he not only brought him back, but came up with his best idea ever. Dagwood went on a hunger strike to convince his parents to give their blessing to him to marry Blondie. The hunger strike lasted for 6 weeks during which this became a national obsession. It was one of the best publicity stunts a comic strip has ever had, and readership on the strip skyrocketed. When it was over, Dagwood renounced his inheritance in exchange for Blondie's hand, and this became a strip about a married couple ever since. Their first child, Baby Dumpling, was born the following year, and that became a publicity stunt as well, with the syndicate encouraging readers to suggest a name for the baby. People were more serious about these sorts of things back then, so Alexander won out instead of some silly name like Baby McBabyface. In Ace Comics, Blondie enjoyed 4 pages an issue, as much as any other comic strip had in this anthology title. I don't know exactly which strips were reprinted in this particular issue, but they were likely from a couple years earlier, possibly 1936, as the strip was actually on hiatus from sometime in 1937 to 1938, as Chick Young recovered from and grieved from the death of his own son, Wayne. Number 43, Funnies number 18. The true crime genre in comic strips traces back to War on Crime that I talked about back in episode 24, but its success spawned many copycat clones. This one, though, is distinctly different. G-Men on the Job came not from comic strips, but the Big Little books that I last talked about in episode 42. The Big Little books use sequential art to tell the story, but with a caption with supplemental text below every single panel. Some Big Little books also use word balloons, but these ones didn't. G-Men on the Job is like true crime, but with a heavy splash of Pulp Fiction mixed in. The current adventure is G-Man versus the Red X. There is a crime boss called the Emperor, who kind of looks like the Kingpin. 2 G-Men overhear the Emperor kill a man, but then the story shifts to follow a single G-Man on this other plot thread, and this is Todd Morgan, who's kind of, sort of, the star of the strip. Todd isn't pursuing the Emperor at all, it seems, but the Red X, and I have no idea how these storylines are going to cross, but eventually I'm sure they do. Todd is recruited by a drunken hoodlum called Stumble Mumble, 9 years before Dick Tracy would fight a villain called Mumbles, to join the Red X's agents. He is given an address to report to, and instead of doing so, and I think this ploy is interesting, he shows up there disguised as a postman and loots their mail to go through it. And he finds a letter written in invisible ink that has evidence that Red X's organization is smuggling marijuana. We have not talked about marijuana in an episode before. I'm not sure how long we'll go before we need to again. But it's worth sharing that, yes, comic books routinely talked about marijuana in the late 1930s and as a bad thing, which was brand new thinking. For almost 100 years, marijuana had been a medicinal drug you could buy over the counter in the US. It was racist feelings towards Mexican immigrants who used marijuana recreationally that led to it being criminalized in 1937. So the stories like this one I've read that talk about marijuana smuggling are ripped from the headlines of the Times. And that's really all I have to say about this feature that only got 2 pages an issue. I do want to add, though, that the Funnies was one of the first comic books to have a letters page, printing things that allegedly had been mailed to them from around the world, and encouraged readers to write in if they wish to be pen pals with any of these people. I've read in multiple sources that the early comic book industry saw 8 years old as the average age of their readership, so I think it's interesting that the average age on this letter page is 13. Number 42. Famous Funnies number 44. I've never liked the strip Babe Bunting and had already decided before to skip talking about it, so is it karma that made this my random choice for this issue? Real quick, Babe Bunting was a comic strip that ran in some newspapers from 1935 to 1940. It was about a little girl called Babe who was abandoned in a movie theater. She was taken in by a kind lady while a search was organized to find the child's mother and resolve the mystery of her missing locket. I didn't get that from reading the strip. I just borrowed that summary from the Lambiek Comicopedia website, link in the comment section below. In this particular issue, Babe has befriended 2 local girls, the good girl Mary Mole and the bratty rich girl Gladys Rakestraw. Mary is dismayed to learn that the Rakeshaws have been helping out Mary's unemployed mother, which Gladys lords over her. With everyone upset, the girls leave the barn they were playing in. Later, and we always know how much later because a caption tells us the exact number of minutes that have passed between panels. Hopefully this is a plot point at some point. Mrs. Rakestraw comes over and says that the candlesticks Gladys had left in the barn were antiques worth $1,000, which is super big money for candlesticks in 1940. When they all go to the barn and retrieve them, they're gone. And so this strip, for the first time I've ever read it, becomes a semi-intriguing mystery of who took the candlesticks. Number 41. Feature books number 10. Popeye and Susan. There are a lot of names you might expect to see paired with Popeye. Olive Oil, Wimpy, even Bluto. But Susan was probably the last name you were thinking of. My spotlight on Popeye episode way back in episode 14 started to fast forward at 1933, so I skipped over talking about Susan Brown entirely. In 1937, with Olive Oil temporarily out of the picture, E.C. Cigar tried to give Popeye a more realistic female lead to play against, in the storyline known as A Sock for Susan. I haven't read it, but there's a lengthy summary of it on the Popeye the Sailorpedia website. I'm going to summarize now that summary. Popeye is walking down the street one day when he sees a woman being arrested for stealing food from Mr. Whisker's fruit stand. The woman, Susan Brown, begs for mercy and Popeye offers to pay the fine, but Mr. Whiskers insists Susan has to go to jail for what she did. Popeye is so angered that he socks Mr. Whiskers in the face, then promises to hold off the police officer while Susan escapes, but Susan is too weak from hunger to run. The policeman, also feeling pity, allows Popeye to take Susan away. Over the next few days, Popeye brings Susan food and clothes at her apartment, until one day he discovers her being kicked out of her apartment by her landlord for being behind on the rent. The landlord further insults Susan and her missing brother, which enrages Popeye again, and he socks another person for Susan. This time, Susan wasn't too starved to run, and Popeye can't find her afterwards, so he goes to the police station to report her missing, when the police chief arrests him for having assaulted Mr. Whiskers earlier. While in jail, Popeye discovers Susan was just picked up too and is in a separate cell. Popeye is able to break them both out as soon as he receives his first meal of prison food that contains spinach, but he pays for the damage before leaving jail. Popeye and Susan go on the lam, living off the land by a lake, fishing for food, when a local constable confronts them about fishing in the town reservoir, which is illegal, and they are jailed again. This time, Popeye refrains from breaking them out, and they stand trial. Courtroom hijinks ensue, but ultimately Popeye reveals that the reason he's gone along with all this is that he figures if Susan goes to jail, she'll at least get food and have a place to stay, which moves the jury so much that they acquit them both. Olive Oil briefly comes into the story when she learns that Popeye has been living with another woman all this time. Angry, she enlists the aid of the magical creature Eugene the Jeep, which is another story for another day, to track Popeye down. Meanwhile, Popeye is boxing for money now to provide for him and Susan until the night Olive and Eugene find them. Olive, still in a raging fury, threatens violence on both Popeye and Susan and has to be repelled by Eugene's electrical powers to save them both. Olive, bitterly rejected, gives up on Popeye, who finally learns more about Susan's past, that her father is actually a millionaire, but has disowned her and her brother, casting them into poverty without any job skills. Popeye decides to confront Mr. Brown in his mansion and convince him to force him to take his daughter back. But Mr. Brown tries to kill Popeye instead, twice. Popeye summons Eugene the Jeep to find out how Mr. Brown turned so evil, but Eugene reveals that this is not the real Mr. Brown. Popeye summons his old friend Castor Oil, who is now a successful police detective these days, and has him on hand to arrest the fake Mr. Brown, who Popeye subdues and then peels his face off, revealing him to be Plastic Pan Panifer, a wanted criminal and master of disguise. Eugene and Popeye track the real Mr. Brown to his basement, where he's been held prisoner and kept half-starved for 5 years, forced to sign checks for Panifer all this time. With Mr. Brown and Susan reunited, there are only 2 unresolved threads to wrap up. 1. Has Popeye and Susan been living in sin all this time together? Susan is clearly enamored with Popeye and asks him to marry her in the end. Popeye, however, thinks Susan is too young for her and has this whole time. And lastly, what happened to Susan's brother? Curiously, Popeye hands this one off to Castor Oil to resolve, which happens entirely off panel and we only hear about later. Was Seagar too eager to start the next storyline? Or was his readership clamoring for Susan to depart and Olive Oil to come back? This is one of those mysteries we can only guess at today. There's actually more to the story than I've summarized here, so do make sure you head to the Sailorpedia and read more, or somehow acquire a copy of the complete E.C. Seagar Popeye Volume 10, Dailies 1935-1937. And it's worth thinking about because so many of the problems in this 88-year-old story are still with us, if not worse today. From landlords having too much power, to rampant poverty and homelessness, too many crimes being punishable by prison time, and too many people thinking this is a good thing, domestic violence from exes, and identity theft. I ran on a bit long this time, so I'm going to wrap up here after just 6 issues. If you want to follow more of this countdown, watch for the next episode, which will be easier if you like and subscribe. So bye for now. Gotta run.